Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series on equality issues. Welcome to the latest Good Employment Charter webinar. Before I open up the webinar and introduce you to our panel, just some housekeeping measures as normal. If you're not on a Chrome browser, perhaps it's best if you swap to a Chrome browser. Some of the panel are laughing about this, but this platform works best on Chrome. If you've got any problems when you're on Chrome, hit the refresh button and hopefully you will be able to access the webinar. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat function as well as questions. We really do encourage you to use the chat function to make contact with each other and network. As you know, these webinars replaced our physical networking events where we used to all get together over a coffee and have a good old chinwag about issues around good employment. We want you to still do that if you can, using the chat function. If you do have questions, either on anything that the panel raised today or more generally, please use the question tab and we'll get them asked and answers back to you. Can I just remind the speakers, when you are speaking, talk directly to the camera so that we can all see as well as hear what you're saying. And whilst we don't have caption capture on this webinar today, we will have that on the recording that will go on our YouTube channel after this event. On to today's subject then. Employment best practice has equality, diversity, and innovation at its heart. However, we also know that these are the sort of issues that are dropped, come under pressure, or are overlooked at times of economic stress. And goodness, we are coming to a period of economic stress. The truth is that efforts need to be redoubled, refocused to ensure that inequalities don't fester and grow. And that's why we believe it's really important that we have an equality series of webinars to bring these issues to the forefront. Good employers know that failure to invest in these sorts of issues is a false economy and in no one's interest. So I'm really delighted that we're talking about disabled people's issues in the workplace today. And I'm really delighted to be joined by an absolute superb panel of speakers. We have Michele Scattergood, who's CEO of Breakthrough UK and a member of the Disability Committee at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Give us a wave, Michele. Hi. We're also, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Kate Headley, Director of the Clear Company. Hi, Kate. Kate's also, and Kate will tell us about the Clear Company, I'm sure, focusing in on support to business on inclusive recruitment and support. But Kate's also was included in the 2019 Diversity and Inclusion Power 100. Sounds very important and a lovely honour, Kate. We're also joined by Lee Jefcott. Hi, Lee. From who's a partner for employment law at Brabners Solicitors. Now, we thought this is an issue that really does need a legal brain as well. It can take employers into areas where lawyers are really important. And finally, not least at all, we're joined by James Williams from Lloyds Bank, who's I think your title is Transformation Group Lead, James. You can correct me later if not. But having spoken to James earlier in the week, I know he's got information to tell us both about Lloyd's approach, but also his own personal experience of issues working with the bank. So without further ado, and we try to keep this to an hour, it would be really great if Michele, I know you've got a few slides to share with us, Michele, in about 15 minutes, just set the scene for us. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. So, really pleased to be here today, and thank you to everyone to giving me the opportunity to talk to Employment Charter members, sponsors, I forget the appropriate name. So the exam question that Ian set me today was, tell us a little bit about the key challenges that disabled people face to accessing good work. Well, I can't promise you a silver bullet, and I can't promise you a definitive list. But what I think I can do is give you insight into your next steps. And I'll help explain to you why I think disabled people face some significant barriers. So who am I? I'm Chief Exec of Breakthrough UK. We're an organisation of disabled people. And I think it's a little bit important to tell you what that means. And Breakthrough is an organisation of disabled people because it means our board of trustees, 60% of whom must be disabled people. And we run at about 50% of our staff are disabled people. We've worked in Manchester and Greater Manchester for over 20 years. We're influencers and we're service providers. So I spend a lot of my time in the influencing space, but I'm really proud that our organisation provides independent living support and employment support to many disabled people. And to give you a sense of that, last year we worked with 600 disabled people, provided employment support for 84 disabled people, and of those 84, 27 gained work. So who are disabled people? Now you might think that's an odd question, but I think it's a really important one because there's some myths and some stereotypes and some assumptions around disabled people. And for me, that starts to begin to build the barriers that disabled people face when they are looking for or hoping to retain work. So interestingly, you often see that symbol that surrounds disabled people, but actually only 5% of disabled people are wheelchair users. Yet 1 in 5 people in the population have some kind of impairment, and 1 in 6 have a mental health issue. So already we've got some common misconceptions that many of you will hold, not through your own prejudice, but because of the imagery or the assumptions that you might have around who disabled people are. Unfortunately, although we are a very diverse group, in terms of our employment issues and barriers, about half of disabled people of working age population will not be in work. And for many of you as employers, you will not know who are the disabled people in your workforce. You may know of some of them, but I would hazard a guess that you will not know of all the disabled people that are in your workforce. You may know of more now because of COVID, because many will have stepped forward and announced they have a long-term health condition that you may not have known about, that may now affect them in their long-term shielding. But for many of you as employers, you will not know who they are because you will have assumed maybe that there are disabled people means mobility impairment on the whole, or an obvious sign of an impairment. So I guess my first message to you today is, please don't assume you know who the disabled people are, either in your workforce or who you may be looking to employ. So it's a few more facts and stats. So as I said, disabled people are twice as likely as non-disabled people to be unemployed. Yet a survey by Scope back in 2015 said that if we got 500,000 more disabled people into work by 2030, it would generate an extra £6 billion for the Exchequer and increase GDP. And another really important fact is impairment does not mean illness. So I think it's really important that we talk about this issue when we talk about disabled people. Many and most disabled people are not ill. People worry that disabled people may be off sick more. I'd like to give you another fact and stat that surrounds Breakthrough UK, for example. So I said earlier that our current staff group stands at about 60–65% of disabled people. Our sickness absence rate last year was 3.28 days per employee. That is lower than the UK average of 4 days. Most staff have no days sick leave a year. So impairment or disabled people doesn't mean extra time off ill. So just a bit of a challenge for you there, that one of the key barriers, so back to my exam question, what are the key barriers disabled people face when getting work? I think one of the key barriers is an assumption of who we are, our skills and our capabilities. So why are we likely to be unemployed? Well, I'd like to put forward that it's a social model and not a medical model as to why we are unemployed. Disabled people face environmental barriers, institutional, attitudinal barriers, and a particular barrier in terms of accessing information. I would challenge that we can make changes and remove those kinds of barriers, but you don't change a person or remove their impairment. Employment barriers can be present at all those sorts of levels, both environmental and institutional. And usually they are not intentional barriers; they are unintentional barriers. Yeah. So when we get to barriers to employment, it's littered at all sorts of levels, and I know my colleagues will probably talk about this in much more detail, so I'm just skimming over it. But it's littered with barriers at all levels, and often it's unintentional. I tend to group them with employment in terms of barriers to get into work, to stay in work, and to progress in work. So, for example, in terms of our recruitment processes, they often favour those who are articulate, who have experience, and who can write well in terms of their applications. Many disabled people don't have work experience and don't have that experience that they can share. Some will prefer not to submit their applications in writing. Some may struggle to articulate in a language you're used to their skills and experience, but in their own language, they're able to articulate it exceptionally well. So there's just an example of how, even in just a couple of examples around recruitment, how we can present barriers that are maybe unconscious and unintentional. I mentioned earlier that one of the other barriers is that you may not know who your staff are. If we do not monitor who applies for work in our organisations, if we do not monitor who is in work in our organisations and at what level they work in our organisations, we're not aware of who our disabled staff are, who we need to have the conversations with to talk about the barriers they may face. Monitoring is a tricky subject. It's a tricky subject, if I could say it. It's a tricky subject, and it's difficult often to get disabled people to declare in the workplace. I challenge and say that actually in a supportive working environment with good management and open conversation, disabled people will declare if they feel they work in an environment that supports that. Again, I'm only skimming over these issues, and people here today may go into more depth. So, what are the barriers that people face in work? Are they steps and stairs? Well, no, they're not. And it's not the most common barrier at all. When disabled employees are asked, workplace adjustments are essential to their retention. 1 in every 2 disabled employees state that a workplace adjustment is the most important issue in order for them to keep work and stay in their job. It's actually also part of the Equality Act to provide what they call a reasonable adjustment. But the most common barriers and the most common adjustments that are required rather to overcome those barriers, what do we think they might be? Do they look like that? Are they a huge, complicated lift to get somebody to work and up some steps? No, they're not. 40% of unemployed disabled people say that it's rigid working hours that discourage them from entering work, and that only 3.1 highlight physical inaccessibility as the barrier. Now, COVID has done an enormous amount to present to us now all the new flexible ways that people can work and the hours that they can work. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. For many disabled people, they were told over and over again, no, you can't work those hours. That doesn't suit the rest of the office. No, you can't join that meeting virtually. It's not appropriate. And for all of us now, we now know that all sorts of things are possible and allow a working environment to go forward and work well. Another little fact there for you, most adjustments that disabled people ask for cost in the region of an average of £200. So they are not that really expensive elevator that I showed. So I'd summarise there to say that one of the key barriers again is around assumptions of what disabled people might need in the workplace. So in summary, what are the key barriers to good work? Assumptions. Their access to training and work experience. Really can't highlight this enough in terms of individual disabled people that we work with in Breakthrough across Greater Manchester. We really struggle to get good placements and work experience for disabled people to fill up their kit bag. If any employers out there in terms of the Good Employment Charter can offer good work experience, we would snap your hand off. Flexible recruitment methods and flexible employment methods, flexibility generally. Lack of monitoring is a key barrier. Knowing who you are, who your disabled staff are, to have a conversation with them, to talk to them about their reasonable adjustments. It's really important, that last point. The most skilled people, and why I'm not offering you a silver bullet today to talk to around the barriers to employment and work, are disabled people themselves and your employees, and how you can gather a really strong picture, have a conversation, talk about what individual reasonable adjustments might look like, and you will unlock the barriers that your colleagues face. More powerfully, it may be helpful to listen to a colleague and an ex-client of Breakthrough UK.
Now, hello. My name is Victoria Howarth, and I've been involved with Breakthrough UK for around 15 years. So I came out of university with a sports degree and was told by the job centre that I could get a job as a cleaner. And I wouldn't be a very good cleaner because I'm registered blind. So it sort of left me with no aspirations and wondering what I was going to do with this degree that I'd worked so hard for. And somebody pointed me in the direction of Breakthrough UK, and they helped me get a job with a company called Sport for Life, where I worked on sports events management, coaching, all kinds of stuff to do with sport. Whilst working at Sport for Life, Breakthrough UK also helped with reasonable adjustments in the workplace, and that was things like making sure that all the steps were clearly marked, exits were clearly marked, and also helping me get a Zoom package from my computer, which meant that everything was zoomed up and I had no difficulty in reading anything. They also introduced and educated myself and the employer, because we didn't have any knowledge of reasonable adjustments or access to work, and access to work actually entitled me to get taxis to and from work, which I didn't know about, and that saved me travelling right the way across the city on public transport, so that was really, like, it came in really useful, and it's helped with my career today, like getting that help in the early days. Obviously, I've moved on and done different careers over the years and different things. I've always known that access to work is there, and I've always known that reasonable adjustments can be there and they can help remove the barriers, which again I didn't know about before having contact with Breakthrough UK. Then went on to go to law school, and again Breakthrough UK stepped in and helped me with a qualified employment space, and then I didn't really want to do law, so I actually applied for a job with Breakthrough UK, where I have learned so much. I didn't know anything about disability rights really and the social model when I joined Breakthrough UK, and now I love helping other people and sort of empowering them to be able to do what I've done and feel as confident as I do in my own skin. What makes Breakthrough so special is that they're a disabled persons organisation, so the person that you're working with understands your impairments and understands the barriers that you're going through, and I think that makes Breakthrough so special and so different as a company. It's been in my life a long time, and I have to say that, and even though I work here now, I don't know what I would have done without Breakthrough in those early years, to point me in the right direction. So thank you, Breakthrough, for being an excellent support and also an excellent employer. And thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
So thank you, Vicky. And to summarise, so just down there, disabled people are the experts. Talk to your employees. Talk to individuals you meet that you are attempting to recruit. Talk to them about what their reasonable adjustments might be and the barriers that they could foresee to work. Impairment does not mean illness. Please try and operate by the social model, not the medical model. Please think about adjustments, not assumptions about who we are. Barriers can be removed. We can't change our impairments. Please don't label or assume that there's certain things that individuals cannot do. The environment is crucial, but the environment is wider than you think, and it really isn't only about steps. There's lots of other things that are eminently sortable, and access to work particularly can help you. And did I say disabled people are the experts?
Michelle, I think you've passed that exam question with flying colours. That was a fantastic overview, and I hope it's set everyone thinking. I think, your 5 points, or the barriers that you put up. I think the last one, the lack of comms, or the lack of communication, lack of conversations, really explodes the first one and educates people about the assumptions they take, and goes back to your point about if you talk to people, if you start to understand their needs, wants, aspirations, then that will explode some of your assumptions. So absolutely fantastic overview. I think it's such a shame. It's always great to hear someone who's participated in a program and lived experience. So Vicky's video was fantastic. Please send back our thanks to Vicky for putting that together. And it's the frustrating thing, I think, about this type of format, webinars, because she would have had a huge round of applause and would have deserved it. Exactly. And I'm sure everyone behind us is applauding Vicky's testimonial. It was fantastic. Thank you, Michele. I'd like to move to you, Kate, now. Find out a little bit more about the Clear Company, and perhaps your view and how you can support employers to be as inspirational as some of the employers that Michele's been talking about.
Thank you, and again, thank you so much, Michele, for that. It was inspiring, and I've got an action to contact you about work experience because our office is within Greater Manchester, and I'd be really interested in that. Thank you. And please pass our thanks back to Vicky as well. A really inspiring story, particularly from somebody like myself, and I'm significantly sight impaired. So knowing that the support out there for people graduating blind or with a visual impairment is fantastically fulfilling for me personally. What can I add? Well, just a little bit about me and the Clear Company, if that's helpful for people, is that so my background is in HR and in recruitment. My interest in disability started long time before I actually became registered partially sighted myself, and Michele's predecessor was extremely supportive to me in those early days when I was coming to terms with a big change in my life, and I'll be forever grateful for that. It's interesting because I spent most of my consulting life saying to people, if you've got a disability, just tell people about it. And have the conversation during recruitment, and I did do a lot of work supporting that. But actually, I had a white stick for 3 years before I used it. So for those employers out there, why is that? I'm confident, I'm articulate, I'm already pretty senior, I'm in my late 50s. So you'd have thought, just get on with it, Kate. But it defined me in a way I hadn't been previously defined, and I wasn't sure I wanted to talk about that yet. Once I'd decided it was a Moses stick that actually party crowds at Euston, I kind of got much more comfortable with it. But I think as employers, one of my messages, you cannot assume that somebody is comfortable talking openly around their disability. But I think there is a way to make that easier. And this is my mantra to all employers, is all you ever need to know about somebody's disability is the impact that has on their ability to access your recruitment processes or to fulfill themselves at work with you. The nature of it, the cause of it, how long it's been going, what's happening in the background. If they want to share, fabulous. If not, impact. That allows you to have a confident conversation, because all you're actually asking anybody is, what can I do to reduce the impact of our recruitment and assessment, or our promotion, or our employment practices on you as an individual? Because I want you to shine, I want you to do your absolute best. And an impact conversation is much easier to have for somebody than a cause conversation. At the Clear Company, we do a lot of work around that. I've noticed some questions coming up down the side, by the way. I am partially sighted, but my right side's got the bit of vision I've got left. So I've clocked a question about the Disability Confidence Scheme, which is a much bigger debate than for today. But somebody said, what do we think of it? So I was one of the founder authors of the Disability Confidence Scheme because I was not at all happy about its predecessor, by the way. I lacked confidence in that scheme. And it's the Disability Confidence Scheme is something that the Clear Company supports. We are disability confident leaders. Does it do everything it needs to do? No. Does it go a lot further than previous projects did? Yes. And in what area? Specifically, employer engagement. So what the Disability Confidence Scheme does that previous government schemes didn't do is access employers and talks in employers' language. So it allows an employer to interpret being disability confident in a safe way. So to answer that question that I've seen come up, have a look at it and get involved. I've got lots I can tell you about the Clear Company, but I'm not going to because this is not the right environment, but I'm very happy to talk to you about it. We sit on the Manchester Ability Forum. We're advising on the Festival at Light. I'm personally an advisor to the Cabinet Office on Disability and Employment. We're passionate about it and we're happy to talk about it. I don't know if that's what you wanted from me, Ian, but that's what you've got.
Okay, that's a great start, and I'm sure the questions and the discussions will run once we've gone around everyone. Lee, can I just turn to you on some of the legal aspects that I think probably are perceived as some of the barriers by employers, thinking it's too difficult, it's too hard. What's your advice, insight on equalities legislation and how that can be turned to facilitate rather than hinder good employment practice?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Ian, and it's great.
You're on mute. Yeah, thanks.
I thought I'd had come off mute. How's that sounding? Is that better? Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay, sorry. Can't get the technology to work sometimes. You know, a lawyer is good at law, but not good at anything else. So it's really good to be here this afternoon. It's fantastic to hear Michele's presentation and to hear from Kate. And I think, you know, as an employment lawyer, we tend to see the situations that have gone wrong, don't we? The situations that are broken, the situations where, you know, the employee has to raise a formal process like a grievance or something to get things moving. So I would say the kind of, you know, one of the learning points that I see is definitely dialogue. I do think, you know, some employers are not equipped with the confidence necessarily to have the right discussions, and therefore there's a misunderstanding that carries on, and then, you know, there's then a dispute potentially. Sometimes it's the other way around. There's the employee or the worker might have, you know, some kind of reticence to kind of bring things up, possibly with the fear that, you know, they don't want to kind of put themselves in a situation where, you know, it might be awkward, or the employer might, you know, they might be putting themselves in the spotlight somehow. So, I mean, I'll be honest, I've dealt with quite a few employment tribunal claims over the years with, you know, people claiming disability discrimination. And, you know, that's obviously a lose-lose situation really for everyone involved. You know, we don't want to be in that position. In terms of the law, try and stay around the law a bit if I'm honest, but the Equality Act is obviously the main piece of legislation there. And, you know, it generally provides that, yeah, employers should not treat employees less favourably on the grounds of protected characteristics, one of which is obviously disability. And there's lots of case law around, and this picks up on something Michele said. Disability is obviously very widely defined in law, a physical or mental impairment, which has a substantial adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities. So very widely defined. It's absolutely not just people in wheelchairs or people with an obvious kind of, you know, impairment. I've dealt with cases where people with autism have brought claims, you know, people with, you know, learning difficulties, and lots of kind of mental health conditions out there as well. In fact, probably mental health more common in litigation than physical issues. Does the law put a barrier in place? I mean, I think the law tries to. I mean, the law is obviously quite protective of employees, and that, you know, employees are given rights to bring claims. I think reasonable adjustments is massively important, and often the employers wonder how far they have to go. You know, what would be reasonable, and who decides? I mean, ultimately, it would be an employment tribunal deciding. But absolutely, you know, as Michele said, you don't have to kind of install a new lift. You know, it's absolutely, a lot of these things are very easy once there's a proper conversation to think about. It might be just disapplying a part of your performance management process, or just relaxing a target, or giving some people a bit more time to do things. You know, they're often quite simple, and some, you know, quite a few of them don't cost any money at all. So I do think, dialogue, try to bring things out in the open a little bit more in a protective environment, and, have those early discussions, I would say. Sorry for the lecture, by the way.
Thanks, Lee. I'm sure we'll get some questions coming through. If you have got any questions, please put them in either the chat or the questions tab, and Julia behind the scenes will pick them up for us. James, can I now turn to you? We always like to have an employer present at our webinars because it is about employment. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, from Lloyds Bank, how has the bank gone about some of these issues? I know you particularly have dealt with a lot of tech solutions to this.
Yep.
So it'd be great to hear some of those, but then, if you can, some of your own personal reflections that we shared the other day.
Yeah, so listening to a lot of the stories, I can totally empathise with what's been said this afternoon so far. I sit on our colleague network, we call it Access, and that represents our disabled colleagues. And that came about from, 20 years ago, the bank did a study into disabled colleagues and the impact that it's had. And one of those parts that came out was, let's set up a network. And also we run a 3-day, the bank runs a 3-day personal development program for disabled colleagues. And that's a great opportunity for me personally, for example. It helped me understand more about my disability. So I'm dyslexic. It was something that was discovered at university, and actually for me, it didn't mean anything to me really, but this 3-day course helped me understand actually the social model, the charity model, the medical model of disability. It really helped me understand that the impact that it has, and it allowed me to walk away more confident into the organisation. And then from that course, for example, I think 55% moved into new jobs who got promotions off the back of it. So it really helped to reinstill that confidence that colleagues really need and feel. I think from a disability perspective is that you sort of worried that you're not able to do stuff, where things like that course, the Access network there is around showing people, linking people up to say you're not alone. And it really comes back to that point of, I think we've all talked about is talking to people. So the Access network works with line managers to help them understand what support we can offer them, what the bank itself can offer, and it helps them really discover who their employees are. So regardless whether a person is disabled or not, you want to know where their strengths lie, where the weaknesses lie, so you can get the most out of them. And one of the key part, we talked about the access to work, where I appreciate very lucky as a large organisation is that we've centralised our access to work approach. So rather than as an individual or a line manager accessing the access to work and the relevant government interactions, we work with Microlink, and we have a internal process where the funding is centralised, because what we did also find was budget holders at a local level were worried that the money would affect their budget. So we took it as a part of a way of doing business into that central piece. So I think as an employee, I'm realising I'm very lucky working in Lloyds Banking Group. But I think at the same respect is we should recognise that we're not perfect. We have a long way to go. And I think one final piece is that we are learning and we are taking it and speaking to colleagues. We are using that to input into our products and our services, to making sure that they are accessible. So that's some of the work that I do myself.
Thank you very much, James. Really useful. Great to have you here, because I understand you had a power cut earlier today. So always great to be challenged with things like that on a day of a webinar. But thanks for joining us. There was a question earlier on in the discussion about disability confidence scheme, and Kate, you've answered it a little bit, but perhaps Michele or any of the panel, have you got other views, or is that the way forward, Michele?
Thanks, Ian. I think that what Disability Confident can do by at least level 2 and a definite level 3 is support an employer to have a framework to think through the issues around employing disabled people and working with disabled people to ensure that that unintentional bias isn't there, that the environment is as positive as it can be. It's only one framework, and it doesn't have to be the only framework. And for me, it needs to be at least level 2 and preferably level 3 for it really to have any kind of leverage in improving the environment of an organisation. So that would be my short answer on Disability Confident. For me, I'd much rather see that kind of framework inside usual quality marks. I'd rather see it in IIP. I'd rather see it in ISI 9000 personally. And for level 1, I think it's for me it's too tokenistic, Ian, if I'm going to be honest. It really is too tokenistic. So level 3, really helpful framework, but there's still stuff to push beyond in that. But it doesn't have to be the only framework, and you could mash some frameworks together and take the best of some that work for you as an organisation.
Great, Michelle. I think really interesting through all of these webinars, we've struck upon core values of an organisation are at the heart of most of this. You know, if you've got the right set of values at the beginning to base your business upon, then the rest comes. Good employment practice comes from that. Can I ask a foolish question? If you are on level 1 or you engage in level 1, is that a stepping stone to 2 and 3? Is that the place to start, or can you go straight in at 2s and 3s? Do you know the answer?
Actually, do you know what? I don't, because I don't. This will be an interesting answer for you, because as a disabled people's organisation, I didn't go for Disability Confident. I didn't feel A, the need, and B, we didn't need that framework.
Okay, Kate, I guess you know, Kate, you designed it.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because in the discussions I had with the DWP when we were setting it up, I'm with Michelle. I can't tell you how hard I fought not to have level 1. Level 1 is essentially a statement of intent, and that's absolutely all it is. It basically says by the end of a year I'll have done something. But most organisations that we work with go straight in at level 2. So you so level 2 is when you become, a disability confident employer status. And what that brings you, as Michelle says, and I agree with you, Michelle, as well. It's not a fail safe. It's not perfect, but it is a very structured framework that gives it's a clear roadmap for any employer through recruitment and through employment of the different stages where barriers and bias can kick in, and the different options you have therefore to positively impact on that and remove those barriers right the way through the employee life cycle. So it's practical, and it's linked to lots of free and paid for resources. We're one of them. And it also links to other standards that can take you more broadly and take you further. So the Clear Assured standard, which is the inclusion standard that the Clear company delivers, actually does incorporate Disability Confident through it, and indeed other standards as well, such as Stonewall, etc. So it makes it clear for the employer. But yeah, you can go in at level 2. Organisations signing up for level 1, the idea is that you sign up, and then you've got the badge on your website, and then that gives you an opportunity to talk probably at leadership level and get some commitment to do more. But it literally is just signing up. I'd encourage everybody to, if you do it because you mean something and you're going to take some steps forward, and that's level 2.
Okay, that's great. I've got a question that's come in specifically for you, James, about the 3-day development course, and I'm presuming it's an internal course at Lloyds and not open to everybody.
That's correct. Unfortunately, it's internal to Lloyds. It's been developed by Phil Friend, who is Disability Rights UK. I used to be in the board of that. But actually, it's something that's been developed. I believe a couple other organisations are picking it up. But there is, I feel like a salesman here, there is a Phil Friend book called Why Pretending to Be Normal. And that book basically takes you through what we do over the course of the 3 days, and through the various interactions. And as I say, I would recommend, it's very well chunked up to sort of deliver some of those key questions that it poses yourself as a person. And then hopefully, say, for me, I've found it's been very beneficial. I look back on those days, those 3 days, as an enabler for me. So there will be trying times where I lack my personal confidence through my impairment, and actually remembering that what that brought me has enabled me to sort of overcome difficulties that I've now faced through my day-to-day work.
Thanks, James. If you could pass us on details of that book, we will share them at the end of the webinar as part of the write-up. One of the questions, I think, was around monitoring. If it wasn't, then it's a question in my head. I was fascinated and sickened at the same time, as one of the first pieces of employment legislation to be put on hold come COVID was reporting of gender pay gaps. Quite astonishing that was the first piece. I think it was the 23rd of March it was put on hold. So, you know, that was a part of employment monitoring that was really starting to make some inroads in larger companies. And I think started to develop a principle about monitoring some of the inequalities in the workplace. So maybe the panel have got views on the importance of how we measure other inequalities, but also perhaps looking at you, Lee, about legal frameworks for this moving forward. Do you think that's something that will come? Who wants to start on that one? Michele?
Shall I
do you want to go
say
first?
a couple of things at the beginning? Yeah, you can hear me okay, can you? Just double checking. Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting point, because it's kind of where do you know, how far should government go and kind of try and achieve change by requiring employers to do things rather than just waiting for sort of change to happen. And I think at the initial sort of stages, when we had the gender pay gap reporting coming in, which is basically the difference in average pay between a male worker and a female worker. There was a lot of people thought, oh, this is just going to be a bit of number crunching, and actually it's not going to make much difference. But boy, oh boy, after 3 years down the line from when it came in, I think it has made a difference. I mean, apart from anything else, it's put it on the agenda for people to talk about, and it's really kind of led to some organisations being, if I can sort of say the phrase, kind of named and shamed almost, by having an embarrassingly large pay gap, and a pay gap that actually is getting worse in some cases rather than better. It was put on hold, Ian, as you quite rightly say, for this year as a reporting round, but absolutely the legislation is still there, and it will continue. And of course, there is now talk about, can we go further? Can we have something like racial or ethnic origin reporting, and that's gathering some momentum as far as I understand it. Disability, that may well be the next one, because if I've got a strong sense that if you look at pay for disabled employees in organisations, you probably see a rather disturbing trend there potentially, in terms of lack of progression and occupying perhaps the lower grade jobs. So yes, I mean, I think it's all to play for. I think it does seem to be a sea change in government. I think there is much more kind of requiring reporting going on now than there was before. And I think for me, it's a positive trend. Thanks, Lee.
I think from the Charter's perspective, we've taken the view that suggesting this and opening it up to discussion is the sort of thing that starts the debate going in terms of reporting. And when people start to look into it, then they realise they're nowhere near where they thought they were. Michele, you wanted to come in.
Yes, please. I'm an absolute avid supporter and speak loudly on the need for reporting. COVID has exacerbated and illuminated the equality gap. There's no doubt. But even prior to COVID, I was a big advocate of monitoring. Now, there's a question in there about how do you support your employees to disclose For me, it's about the environment and the organisation. And you said earlier, Ian, about values. If you live your values and behave in a way that supports your values, you should be able to create a really positive environment. So in terms of positive images and messaging, foster and create a space where disabled people feel that they are disclosing because it'll be supportive to them and welcomed and not held against them for another reason. And for me, it doesn't come easily, and it takes a lot of hard work in terms of that environmental shift and that messaging. Social model training, which Joe's mentioned, really important. So for all employees, not just non-disabled people, but for people to think about it in that way and foster that environment, to think about the barriers that might be in the organisation. Supporting disabled people to come together privately, in a private space where people don't know they're there necessarily, to talk to each other. Peer support is really, really important, and peer support can begin to foster the positive challenges in the positive challenge within an organisation to monitor and monitor better. I've worked around disability equality issues as a disabled person my whole entire working career, and it frustrates me enormously that we are stuck on a hamster wheel, that people aren't prepared to step into the world of monitoring in order to see what dams it will break in terms of change. It frustrates me enormously. Now, there are changes afoot, I believe, and I am a member of the Disability Advisory Committee for Equality and Human Rights Commission, and I and others push hard for it there. We, as a group of organisations, have been having conversations with the Minister for Disabled People regularly through COVID, and he is launching consultation on a new disability strategy, and he is looking at monitoring within that. Now, the gap is tricky, the pay gap is tricky, and we've got a long way to go, I think, before it's only about pay gap. Because what I don't want to do is discourage people who particularly offer entry-level work to some disabled people, and then for good work their pay gap will look enormous, whereas other people who aren't offering that opportunity won't show a gap. So I think it needs to be more sophisticated and nuanced, but actually we need to get some of the basics right. We need to start encouraging, by a supportive environment, disabled people to disclose, and I think it's possible. 65% of my staff are disabled people. I've seen many organisations change that, Lloyds being one of them, that you foster that environment, people will fill in the equality monitoring form, so we can begin to monitor where disabled people are or are not in the organisation and their retention.
Ian, can I just follow on from Michelle's point there, from
Please.
Within a large organisation? Some of the challenges we find is, as Michele said, a majority of our disabled colleagues sit down at the sort of lower grades, and we do struggle to build out, identify people at the higher grades and that disability, and whether that's from a point of view of there are no people with a disability in the high grades, which I extremely doubt, because you talk about stats, 1 in 2 people over 75 have a disability, so someone up at that range would have acquired a disability through their time. It's about, are they concerned or worried that by displaying a disability they show some form of weakness? I think a lot of disabled people might sort of say that it is their super strength, their disability, about how they go about, they live their life, what they've had to overcome. But I think one of the key bits we're trying to drive out, and like Kate as being at the top 100 disability role models, is having that within Lloyds. By having role models, we can start to understand and normalise that conversation within people, so they can A, identify and know people with disability, but B, potentially identify in themselves that they have a disability. We struggle within Lloyds, a lot of people consider themselves not to have a disability, but when they might legally have a disability. So it's some of those pieces of trying to open up that conversation so people can start to understand who they work with and what the experiences and challenges they face.
Ian, am I able to
Please, Kate.
loop in very quickly there, because I agree with and support everything I've heard so far as well. We have a slightly different approach at the Clear Company. We provide a managed adjustment service through recruitment and at work for a number of large and smaller organisations that works slightly differently in that it's a proactive product. So it asks every single colleague, all sorts of questions right the way through their recruitment experience and through their work experience. So again, it's not identifying in terms of, you know, do you have dyslexia, for example? What it identifies is where there's an impact about you that we need to know about to make an adjustment in your workplace or in recruitment. We've got 98% level of disclosure of impact related issues from people with disabilities who still might not say they have a disability, but will definitely say they need an adjustment at work. So what that creates for an employer is a starting point for the dialogue, because we've now created an environment of trust. We're asking for the information so we can provide supportive response to that information, and we get the dialogue. And you know, so I work with the other Lloyds, the Lloyds with a comma, so Lloyds of London, who have this in place. And one of their colleagues who is blind, in fact, she's registered blind, was completing her Clear Talents profile in terms of adjustments, and her colleagues circled around and all wanted to do it as well. And we were actually piloting it with their colleague network that we were just discussing at Lloyds, but actually it created such a momentum that everybody wanted it. So it comes back to my original comment about monitoring, and I think to Michele's original point as well, that I really wouldn't advise you to go straight into trying to monitor until you've got viable data. And to get viable data, we need to be talking to our colleagues and getting those discussions happening around our life circumstances, and whether it's so my daughter has very severe arthritis. She was only diagnosed 2 years ago. She wouldn't consider herself as having a disability. She wouldn't tick a box on any form around that. But she is aware she's autoimmune. She's aware she needs to ask for some adjustments in terms of her process at work. Very different conversation. And I think for the younger generations coming through, it needs to be a very different conversation. And then we can monitor, and maybe if we could think of a word other than monitoring, that might be hugely helpful as well, because we need that data, but we need those conversations first. So that would be my take on it, Ian, if that's helpful for everybody.
I'm sure that absolutely is, Kate. Again, you know, another theme that comes through these discussions around good employment is trust. And the building of trust between employers and employees, absolutely essential. Maybe we just need a webinar just about how do you build trust. We've only got about 7 minutes left. You know, these go so quickly. So I'd like to do a couple of questions if we can quickly. One's maybe a little bit on the downside, and then hopefully one's more uplifting. So we'll take the down one first. In terms of COVID, what does the panel think in terms of the trends in terms of employment and disabled people coming through and coming out of COVID? Anything that we need to be aware of and guard against? I think we know. Michele, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to kick us off. I'll tell you what, I'll start with a positive answer on it instead of saying the obvious one first. So I think positively, haven't we seen employers and employment environments operate in a totally different way? So I'll go back to my previous point. So in terms of the flexibility that disabled people ask for, flexible working hours, different approach to work, they've come out in bucket loads. So what I hope is, as organisations, we all learn about how we can do things so differently that create a completely different barrier-free environment for some of our colleagues. So that's I would say that in terms of that, there's a positive. I guess the negative impact is, first of all, I'm really, really worried about the impacts of the recession. So I've already said, half of disabled people are likely to be unemployed. I'm really worried about the increasing numbers of disabled people in that queue, and how far some of our young disabled people particularly are pushed further and further from the jobs market without that work experience. Without that experience. I'll go back to that again, that work experience, a genuine work experience, not a day at the photocopier, genuine work experience and what it can add to somebody's kit bag. I think also the concern that many disabled people have at the moment is being asked to go back to work too soon. So we've had, the government have told many disabled people we're vulnerable. Not a word many disabled people like to be called, can I just say, but that's another webinar again entirely in terms of language and disabled people, or language and anybody. I don't much like to be called vulnerable, but because of the language being around for quite a while now, it's really not helped. And a number of disabled people are quite scared in terms of coming back to work too soon. So again, a role for employers there about good conversations about people easing back into work carefully and appropriately. They're my main points, I think.
Thank you. Kate, please.
I'll be very quick because Michele's covered most of it. One of the additions to that is that one of the negative impacts of COVID from a disabled colleague's perspective is those subtle adjustments that happen with the team around you. So when I'm talking to disabled colleagues with a myriad of different impairments, they've got their adjustments in place, but there's also the team member that notices when they're thirsty, the team member that notices when they need a door opening, and if they're at home and they're working in isolation and not everybody's got a family around them, that's had quite an impact. And I would encourage all employers to reach out to their disabled colleagues who are working at a distance now, and just making sure they've got that wraparound colleague team environment support with those subtler adjustments that enable people to be confident at work.
Lee, have you got any views on what it's going to mean in terms of maybe claims issues coming forward?
Well, I mean, I think, I've been really busy kind of advising employers about, getting people back to work and working, particularly where they can't work from home. And of course, people with health conditions, are going to find it more difficult to do that. I just fear, and I hope that I'm wrong, that we don't end up having a two-tier workforce where, we have people who are suffering from health conditions and disabilities being left behind in some way, whether that's kind of, stuck at home when they could be working in the office, or it's too difficult, so it's put onto the difficult train, they're left on statutory sick pay, which is obviously a very low sum. So I do think, that I hope that's not going to be the case, and I hope that kind of HR teams and managers are going to work with people to, to make sure that they're not left behind in that way.
Thanks, Lee. James, have you got anything to say on that one, or?
Just a brief one. I think on a positive note, it's the empathy. So a lot of disabled colleagues sort of feel that isolationism, the fact is that they can't come into the office for various reasons, and so actually we're starting to see that benefit of people working from home, and starting to, it's not a great position to be in, that they feel that isolation, but at least they're starting to understand that empathy that many disabled colleagues might have within the working environment.
Thanks, James. Jane, I hope that's answered some of your questions around COVID. I want to finish on Marco's question, or at least his proposition that the McKinsey report about diversity increases productivity has been around for a long time now. But has the message stuck, or is the message not getting through? So my challenge, or my last question to you all: how do we get the message across to those that are making decisions that this is fundamental to productivity and successful organizations moving forward? Yeah, James, go.
Yeah, I think it's we're recognizing the Lloyds, it's really important. We talk about human-centered design, where we develop based on not on a product, not on a service, but actually the human needs, and being able to we recognize the ability to have diverse thought is really important to start to understand the different needs. And so I take disability as a really good example, is that accessibility is not about disabled people. I keep telling it to people within the organization. It is about making a product or a service accessible. So if someone with sort of poor sight cannot read a website and we make it accessible so they can, it means that other people can read a really good website. And so it's thinking about the positives that being accessible brings to you and your services and the customers that you reach. So let alone the fact is you have sort of 17% of people are disabled, it's a sense of saying 100% of people can access your website or your services. And I think that's really important.
Thanks, James. That's a really good way of looking at it. Kate, Michele, Lee, anything to add? Kate?
Yeah, I'm happy to add. I mean, obviously, this is what we do as a day job a lot of the time, although we would hope that if we're being retained by an organisation, they kind of got the business case a little bit. But for me, it comes back as well to that part about the hidden disabilities. So if we stick specifically with disability within diversity, It's about making sure that you're putting a business case across to have the most inclusive policy, process, practice, so the best possible talent can join your organisation and can thrive in it. And there's lots of statistical evidence that proves that if you get that right, you make more money. McKinsey's report is one of them. But actually, if you make it relevant to the organisation, now, I remember sitting down with the finance director of a serious energy company, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, who wouldn't put budget aside for disability confidence training and for investment in the recruiters in inclusion training, until we put the stats, some of which Michele's alluded to already, which are regularly produced by the HSE in terms of productivity, retention, lower sickness absence levels. And the figure that we came up with calculating with him at his desk was something like a saving of 1.6 million if he invested this 25k in the training and awareness for his team. So funnily enough, we did that, and we went on to do quite a lot more with them. But it's to me, I mean, I am quite bold in my approach. That's just my personal style. But I always say to people, if you're saying they won't listen to me, they don't get the message, then you're not doing your job right. It's your job as a recruiter or an influencer or an HR person in an organisation to get the right message that hits the pain or the gain of your organisational leader, so they listen to you. And that's about being commercial in what you're trying to do. That's my top tip.
Okay, I'm not sure that can be topped, actually. No, so we have overrun. Like Vicky, I think everyone is now applauding you and saying thank you very much, because that was a tremendous overview. And I think it's only an overview at this stage, a start for what we want to take forward. In further webinars, we'll be looking at specific areas of disability. We're already talking to colleagues, I think it's in the Autistic Consortium, about how we can work together on a future webinar. Just to say that the Growth Company next Wednesday, I think, has a webinar on the Disability Confidence Scheme, funny enough. So we can drop some information about that to you at the end of the session as well. That was completely unplanned, and I only found that out this morning. So we've set that up quite nicely for them. Also, our next webinar, and it links to this also, will be on employee engagement and voice. So that's a key element about how we talk to and engage properly with employees. So look forward to seeing everyone then. Thank you, James. Thank you, Lee. Thanks, Michele. Thanks, Kate. You've been tremendous. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Good afternoon, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.